Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, a bonus episode here because the regular season is here. It is here for the Bucks tomorrow, but it is here overall today as we record this on a Tuesday. And boy, do we have some news to update you on. So we'll get to the latest for both the Bucks and the 76ers and everything you need to know for tomorrow night's game in Philadelphia coming up after this on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined as always by Camille Davis. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen each and every day, free and available wherever you get your podcasts, and now available in newsletter form as well. That's right, Locked On Bucks Daily, your one-stop shop for ultimate team and league coverage delivered right to your inbox. Sign up now for free at lockedondaily.com. LockedOnDaily.com. Start your day with the all-new free Locked On Bucks newsletter. Today's episode of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Camille, it is here. So we got two games tonight, the Celtics and the Knicks, right? I should know these. And Lakers, Timberwolves. We have Tuesday night basketball is the big thing to look forward to. Of course, the Bucks play tomorrow night in Philadelphia. And I think we were all bracing ourselves for the very real possibility that Khris Middleton would not play. As you saw the preseason go further and further, and Khris Middleton not playing in those games, and then Doc Rivers confirmed it just the other day. But man, did we get a doozy earlier today.
Yeah.
I think just as we thought that's where it was headed with Khris, you could make the logical assumption Paul George wasn't going to play in this game if he was going to be reevaluated Tuesday. That typically doesn't mean you're playing Wednesday. Everything that I had seen, and we'll get into all the specifics around how we got here, but everything I had seen leading up to yesterday was, well, the general assumption is Joel Embiid is going to play.
Yep.
He is not going to play. And not only that, Shams Charania dropping the bomb of, well, I suppose we should find something else if it was Woj bomb.
Mm-hmm.
He's not going to play the entire first week, at least. So you have a marquee national game tomorrow where maybe ESPN is wondering, can we flex this thing that suddenly no Khris Middleton, no Paul George, no Joel Embiid. And look, it wasn't my intention, but man, how apropos that tweet that we mentioned on the show a couple, 10 days ago, of the similarities between games played for Khris Middleton, Joel Embiid, and Paul George. And here we are.
With the biggest difference being the role that those players play on their respective teams. As we have said multiple times, Khris Middleton is a third option on the Milwaukee Bucks. Meanwhile, Joel Embiid is like the engine for that team. He is their best player. And then you have Paul George, who was the other part of their big three. One might argue he's that third option there, which I think is fair given how Maxey has been playing. But now we're setting up a situation on opening night that I didn't think that we would be in. I thought this would be a question that we would answer later on in the season, which is, how can the 76ers survive? How do they look? All of the above when they are without Joel Embiid and or Paul George. The 76ers already are a smaller team outside of Embiid and Drummond. So it's like from there, you don't have Embiid. You lose a lot of size that you have on that team. And when you're going with a team like against the Bucks, where you have Brook Lopez, you have Giannis, you even have Bobby off the bench who's 6'10", like there is going to be a size disadvantage for that 76ers team. But yeah, I didn't expect Embiid to be out the opener. Paul George was the one. Who else that we might be without Paul George in this game, given that he had a preseason injury with that hyperextended knee. But now we're in a situation where there's no Embiid, there's no Paul George, and it'll be the first test of what I think is going to be quite a few for the 76ers this season of, well, how do you pick up the slack when you're missing your top guys?
And I mean, let's just be clear. The reality is missing a game or games in October, November, it's not a big deal.
Right.
Some other pieces to this, I think, are maybe not a big deal yet, but you at least have raised an eyebrow and said, I'm going to need to check back on this. Like the fact that, as we learned as well, he's going to have these basically scheduled times off throughout the course of the season where there's going to be a stretch of load management to the max, I guess would be the way to deem it. It's not just going to be, and I think at this point we have to assume what he said is true in that he's not going to play in back-to-backs in both games of a back-to-back, not only this year, but he said for the rest of his career, that's probably going to be the case. But if you're already building in things too, like, well, when we got this stretch of 3 games in 5 days or things like that, let's just find these pockets on the schedule where we can give Joel 2-3 games off, something like that. I mean, look, we've made the same case for Khris Middleton. I'm not as concerned because we want him healthy for the postseason. If that's the Sixers' intention, we'd be hypocritical to push back. Man, this is worrisome and problematic. The difference is what you mentioned at the top there. Joel Embiid is the guy for the 76ers. And even Paul George, who is the third guy in Philadelphia, I think the difference there is, what we kind of experienced the last few years with the Bucks is, if that is the case, where either your main guy or one of your big 3 has those question marks surrounding in terms of availability, you need the other 2 to be reliable and dependable, and guys that you say, okay, it's one of those stretches, we need more from you. That hasn't been the MO of Paul George's career.
Yeah, it hasn't. And the 76ers have some optimism around his injury. They've only officially ruled him out for tomorrow's game against the Bucks. It's a chance that he does play later on this week in the 76ers' second game of the season. But here's what's going to be interesting is the play style, too, of the 76ers without Embiid and without Paul George out there. I watched one of their preseason games, which, yes, I'm that level of sicko. I'm watching all kinds of preseason games of different teams at that. And the 76ers were against the Brooklyn Nets,
Did you? Oh my God!
I know.
Did you get it? Did you get any Nets or Wizards games?
I was going to say levels to the sickness of basketball watching, and yes, the Nets are going to probably be really bad. But one thing I did notice when they did not have Embiid or Paul George on the floor was that they got some athletes over there in Philly now with Kelly Oubre over there, with Martin over there, with Caleb Martin, and they're going to play really fast. And it's one of the things that we talked about with KJ yesterday on the show of like, what are things that we're looking for from the Bucks and things that might concern you. And I'll be really interested to see how the Bucks respond to the 76ers in transition, because I think they are going to get out and run. Like they have the guys to do that, and they're going to be smaller. So I think they're going to try to use that to their advantage without Embiid. So during tomorrow's opener, that's one thing for the Bucks side I'm going to be really paying close attention to.
It's a much different team. It's what I think 3 guys basically that were on the team last year for Philly that are still with the 76ers. We spent a lot of time talking about Philly on Locked On Bucks here, but it was just not jarring news, but it was newsworthy to learn, oh, wow. So it's already starting here. And it brings up some other questions that the Bucks are going to face as well when we get into the availability discussion and what that means for an Eastern Conference that is going to be better top to bottom, save for the bottom 2 or 3 teams in that conference and what that means long-term. So I do want to get into some of that conversation. The Khris Middleton piece that everybody cannot get enough of. And a question I have for you about what tomorrow's game actually means for the Bucks. Is this a no-win situation that they're in? So we'll get into that conversation coming up in just a minute here on Locked On Bucks. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, and do this all on the same page where you place your bets. You get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. To get started, just head over to FanDuel.com. All right, Camille. Khris Middleton, I mean, we had the conversation already. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of I told you so's in the comments. But I think we were ready for this and prepared for this. The one thing, again, I don't use the word panic or extremely concerned just yet in October. But the one thing, as you and I were talking before we started to record, that made you raise an eyebrow and just think, oh, where is this headed? Was when Doc Rivers was asked about not only his status for the game, but basically the prognosis and when can we expect to see him? And basically added, look, even if this was a playoff game, not a guarantee that he would play in it.
A big maybe. Like Doc was asked about it. He admitted, like, hey, at this point, Khris Middleton wasn't able to do 5-on-5 at today's practice, Tuesday, today. So yeah, he's officially out against the 76ers. And to your point about if it was a playoff game, he'd probably be playing or at least close to it. And we've heard a lot of closes and soons and everything like that from the Bucks throughout last season. So from Doc at that. Yeah. So it's not necessarily comforting to hear that. But one thing I will look from what Doc said that I take as a positive is Doc said there were no setbacks. There were no setbacks for Khris. Yeah. So at this point, they are still just ramping him up. Nothing has happened where it's like, we expected this, but instead we're getting this. It's just a case of like, we're taking our time. We want to make sure that we're being smart with it, and we'll get him on the court when it's important for us to try to get him on the court, which again, like we've been talking about throughout this episode so far, you see the similarities there with Milwaukee and Philly, because the question that Milwaukee has coming into the season, the biggest one has been health. And how are they going to be able to make it to that finish line? So again, like how they are looking at Embiid in Philly, where they're trying to put a plan together to make sure that they have him on the court, come playoff time, and that he's ready to go then. It's what the Bucks are trying to do with Khris Middleton as well. Just make sure that he's healthy and able to get in some consistent run once he does come back. You don't want to bring him back too early, have a setback, and then, he's missing more games. Like you want to make sure to get into that rhythm whenever it is that he does come back.
I'm not ready to just sign off on this is going to be the same as Embiid and Khris isn't going to play in back-to-backs. I mean, if you forced me to make a prediction, I would say, yeah, I would probably think there's a very slim chance that he's going to play in back-to-backs this season for the team. But again, it's why we just pointed out the facts and didn't give too much judgment on Philly, because it's October. And to me, I mean, I don't know if there's a date for you or time on the calendar when you're officially, we had this conversation last year too, but if you're officially worried about Khris, all I know, it's kind of like Doc's answer that he gave about where do you need to be in terms of your defensive rating and offensive rating to be a good team, and said, well, there's a number. You don't know what it is, but you know what it isn't. So like, I know what it is when I see it, basically. And that's kind of the feeling that I have surrounding Khris Middleton and his status and availability. I'm not worried in October. I'm not really worried in November. Like I know when it gets to the point, when I get there, I know when I'll be worried. I just don't know that I can give a date of when that is yet.
Yeah, I probably don't have a definitive date. I mean, the saying of the NBA season doesn't begin until Christmas. Like once you get to the Christmas Day game, at that point, you kind of got to do some checks and lock in at that point. But so at the latest, I can give a date for, like, if I can say like, hey, if it's not by here, I'm really concerned.
April 14th or whatever.
That's the biggest concern right there. That's a fact. But I'd probably say like in that December range, if we're still hearing like questionable things by that point, like that'd be way too long based on what we've been hearing at this point about him being close, considered day to day. He's traveling with the team to Philly. So like if we get far out where it's like, what is happening at that point, I would probably have some red flags.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to throw any dates out there or jump to conclusions, but it's probably your best bet, everything that we've heard, to just assume the first 7 games, is it, when you wrap up that stretch with the Grizzlies on Halloween night? Maybe we don't see Khris through any of those games. And to your point, I'm not really concerned until we start to creep into November and you're hearing more of the same and the statuses haven't changed. I mean, I am going to take Doc Rivers and the rest of the staff at their word. And as you pointed out, there were no setbacks. It was none of that. It was none of Khris re-aggravated anything. This is all about, let's be extra cautious. Let's make sure he's 100%. And I think one of the big motives this season too is to not push through things and to not say, well, I'm 80%. Like if it was a playoff game, you would play. Well, it's not the playoffs. And we've seen playoff games without those guys. So I do think they have more of a luxury that they're afforded this year in to take that approach because, as we talked about in our first conversation with Chris yesterday, Johnson, the roster is just better. It makes more sense. I'm not saying it's a better roster top to bottom than the Celtics, or it's as talented as teams like the Knicks or the Sixers, but it is a better group than it was a season ago, and the pieces fit better than they did a season ago.
Yeah, they absolutely do, which brings us to the season opener tomorrow night, where, again, you don't have Khris Middleton, but you have Taurean Prince, who you can bring in off the bench to start in Khris Middleton's place and go from there. So I'm looking forward to tomorrow's game. I did see some fans who lost a little bit of excitement since, you don't have the star power as expected for the season opener for the Milwaukee Bucks. But, I mean, listen, y'all, we made it through a very long offseason. And we are finally at the point where we're at the regular season. It is starting. It is here. Tuesday night as we record this, games are kicking off and we see the Milwaukee Bucks on Wednesday. So, it might not have the same star power, but as a Bucks fan or someone who's interested in the Bucks, it's still exciting to finally see your team hit the floor after a very long offseason.
I'm getting tired of long off seasons too. That I could go for one of those short off seasons like we had in 2021. And
I know that's right.
Really 2020 too, when you factor in after the bubble where the Bucks were knocked out the week of Labor Day, and then training camp started a month and a half later. The draft was in November and you get started the week of Christmas. So I could go for more of those types of off seasons again. Some final thoughts on this matchup and what I asked you too about what does this mean tomorrow with the players that are going to be available, and how is this going to be viewed? We'll save you the extra step of dragging yourself through some of those national talking head shows. We already know what the talking points are going to be come Thursday morning. We'll tell you what they are coming up after this here on Locked On Bucks. Time to talk to you now about our friends over at Game Time. You have heard both Camille and I talk about our experience using this app. I mentioned using it to see my St. Louis Blues when they were here in Milwaukee just a couple of weeks ago. I used it last summer as well when I was in Detroit for SummerSlam and took in a Tigers game as well. It is truly the best ticket purchasing app on the market. And here's a couple of reasons why. Like when I was in Detroit, if you're in a venue, stadium, arena, wherever it is, seeing a place you haven't been before, you can get an panoramic view from within the app. See what your seat view is going to look like before you get to that screen to purchase your tickets. Toggle on the feature as well for all-in pricing, where you can see the total upfront cost with no surprise fees and sticker shock once you get to checkout. Comes with the lowest price guarantee as well, where Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference if you find those seats cheaper elsewhere. And best of all, your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Not just sports, concerts, comedy, theater, any event you can think of, get your tickets on Game Time. So take the guesswork out of buying those tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem that code LOCKEDONNBA, LOCKEDONNBA, for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time. I think the talking points for this game are painfully clear, Camille. This is, I mean, it's one game out of 82. And just as we said, it's not a big deal if you miss games in October. It's when it becomes habitual. It's when it, lingers into December and the second half of the season. But this is 1 out of 82. This isn't 1 out of 17 in the NFL. So that's one of the things to keep in mind. But let's be clear. This is a no-win spot for the Bucks, because if the Bucks look like the team we envision them to be, and hey, maybe not necessarily everything's fixed, but the Giannis and Dame pairing is what we thought it would be. The defense looks better. They're rebounding the basketball. Taurean Prince and DeLon Wright and Gary Trent Jr. all show, man, these are market upgrades from where we were a season ago. Everything goes your way. So what? You beat the Sixers without Joel Embiid and Paul George. If it's the opposite and you look bad and you lose this game, even if it's 1 out of 82, it's the Bucks can't even beat the Sixers without their top 2 guys or 2 of their top 3. same old Bucks and same old Doc Rivers. Like that is what the Bucks are facing Thursday morning.
It is, and that is why it is important for everybody who can hear our voice right now just to keep that perspective once the national media starts talking about this season for the Milwaukee Bucks. Just keep reminding yourself it is one game. It is the first game at that. So like regardless how people try to frame it, understand the context of where the Bucks are in this particular season. Don't get too high, don't get too low. And for the Bucks, they just got to go in there and focus on themselves. Like Doc Rivers has mentioned that yes, he wants to make sure they get to the playoffs healthy, but he also wants to make sure that when they are playing, that they are looking really good and that they're dominating. So like whatever happens, regardless of the fact that Embiid's not out there, regardless of the fact that Paul George is not out there, this is a Bucks team that is still installing offensive sets. This is a team that is still working on really adopting their new defensive identity that they're having now. So like, it's still going to be a very important game for the Bucks in that sense, regardless of who the opponent actually is. This is a mirror game. Work on yourselves and make sure that you do what you need to do when you're out there. And that's how I'm taking it. And of course, I'm going to use this chance to plug the fact that if you get bored of listening to the national media, just make sure you keep it locked into Locked On Bucks. We're going to have you covered after post game, Monday through Friday, every day. So we try to keep it logical, cool-headed, and everything like that. So make sure y'all stay locked in to Locked On Bucks.
So tomorrow night, 6:30 is the tip time. 6:43, if you're very interested, is the tip time in Philadelphia for the Bucks and the 76ers. Just 2 games tonight, and I'm very much looking forward to both of them, the Knicks and the Celtics, the Timberwolves and the Lakers. We get to see both teams that were a part of that big trade in the T-Wolves and the Knicks and how their new pieces fit. We get to, I'm guessing, see LeBron James and Bronny James share the court in a regular season game tonight and then tomorrow. And I mean, look, I suppose we should also point out we get to see how do these New York Knicks look against a Celtics team that is going to be without Kristaps Porzingis, but how do they match up against that team that we've been led to believe they're mirroring with the way that they fit that personnel? Tomorrow, all the attention for everybody viewing this show and listening along is going to be at 6:30 in Philly for the Bucks and the 76ers. But there's a couple of other interesting games that I've got my eye on. The all Florida battle between the Heat and the Magic. Orlando's a team that seen a lot more people picking to be in the top 4, pushing the top 4 in the Eastern Conference. What version of the Heat are we going to see here? Is it going to be the same old Miami Heat? Is it going to be back to what we saw in the early part of the 2020s? The Suns and the Clippers. We get to see Coach Bud with his first regular season game coaching the hometown team, Phoenix Suns. Have you seen Bud at all in the preseason?
I have not.
Camille, I mean, it is jarring how good he looks. He has dropped a ton of weight. He looks really good. He looks really good. So I think a lot of Bucks fans are going to be pulling for the Suns 80 times a year, and Coach Mike Budenholzer as well.
Mm-hmm.
You got the Bulls in New Orleans. I wouldn't point this out for any other reason than Lonzo Ball making his return in the preseason and seeing what he can do. If that's another Derrick Rose type of situation, how the injuries kind of derailed things, but he still managed to carve out a niche as a role player rather effectively towards the end of his career. So not a whole lot of marquee value on the schedule tomorrow, but those are the interesting ones. I think the big ones for the rest of the week. On Thursday, you don't have the national schedule anymore because the NFL just says, all right, the NBA says, take Thursdays. We'll take it back in February. But you do have the Western Conference champion Dallas Mavericks hosting Victor Wembanyama and the San Antonio Spurs. And if you're a true sicko, some late night basketball, the Denver Nuggets and the Oklahoma City Thunder, 2 very interesting teams that were in the top 3 last year. A lot of people down on Denver, a lot of people very, very high on the Thunder, and the Timberwolves in Sacramento to take on the Kings. 2 games in 3 days for Minnesota to start the season. 2 days to start the season.
A busy start for them, but yeah, there are a lot of good games this week, and I'm looking forward to it. The Nuggets and the Timberwolves is one in particular, or I'm sorry, Nuggets and Thunder is one I'm looking forward to just to see how they look. The Isaiah Hartenstein injury is a blow for them, but just getting Chet back out there and seeing year 2 of this team as we saw them last year is going to be really fun to see. And I'm even interested in some of the projected bottom of the conference team games as well. Like, You have Pacers, Pistons tomorrow, which I know people are like, what? But I've said it before. I think the Pistons are going to be better this year.
Yeah, I think they're going to push for the 10 seed.
I do too. I think that they might claim that 10 seed this year. So I'm looking forward to seeing how the Pacers come out looking this season after they had the run that they did last year. Like, there's just a lot of good ball going on. So when the Bucks aren't playing, I'm going to be locked in. So shout out to NBA 2K for getting me that locker code, the code to be able to have NBA League Pass. I am going to be taking good advantage of that.
Friday too, Knicks Pacers. You have the JB Bickerstaff revenge game with the Pistons in Cleveland against the Cavs. Warriors Jazz. Everything that was kind of linked between those two teams was Lauri Markkanen close to becoming a member of the Golden State Warriors. The Suns and the Lakers, Coach Bud in LA against that team. And of course, the Bucks home opener against the Chicago Bulls, 7:00 at Fiserv Forum. So it is finally here. We may not see all the stars tomorrow night, but we're going to see Giannis and Damian Lillard, and we're going to see all the new pieces and get a better sense of what's real that we saw in the preseason, like the rebounding things that we talked about in part 1 with Chris Johnson. Does that improve? Are the defensive scheme, like, is this closer to what the Cavs ran, especially with Greg Buckner? What's the rotation? Do we see A.J. Johnson play in a regular season game, especially against a team that you said we think is going to push the pace and play up tempo here? So the preseason games, there were some minor takeaways, but you threw a lot of it out because it's preseason. As Doc was quick to point out, we didn't install everything yet. They still haven't, right? As he's pointed out, we're not doing that until Chris gets there. So it's still not there, but the intensity goes up a level now for the regular season. And we get our first crack at it tomorrow night. We will have the post-game show with Frank joining us once again to recap the Bucks and the 76ers, the season opener tomorrow night. We got one more show tomorrow, too. We continued our conversation with Chris Johnson, touching on some more things, especially what he's seen from A.J. Johnson and some of the young guys that he's had a chance to see up close. So that comes your way tomorrow morning as well. And of course, the home opener Friday night, we'll see if we can put together a preview for that one. And as always, look, if you're in the arena, if you're going to a game, stop by and say hello. If you see us in the radio booth, me and Dave Kane. But it's finally here, Camille. NBA basketball. No longer have to wonder, what am I going to do with my evenings?
No longer wondering, trying to put things together. Less outside time as well, which is perfect as it gets cooler, or theoretically should be getting cooler here in Milwaukee. It's been hot the last couple of weeks. So just looking forward, it's getting darker outside earlier. It's time for some basketball, and I can't wait.
It is time for some basketball. That'll do it for today's show. Again, remember, tomorrow morning, part 2 of our conversation with Chris Johnson. And then the post-game show comes your way tomorrow evening. Back to actual meaningful post-game shows. And by that, I mean games that count in the actual standings. But that'll do it for this one as we took a look at the Bucks and the 76ers. For Camille, I'm Justin. We will talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.